Now, whichever theory will ultimately prove to be correct about how the human mind achieves deductive reasoning, it will have to somehow explain the fact that we often seem to make use of non-strictly logic strategies and logic reasoning in order to solve deductive inferences. In fact, we often make use of heuristic and non-properly logic information in order to solve um, these inferences. Let me give you some examples. And the first one is known as the belief bias. In fact, let's try some deductions together. Let's start with syllogism number 2. Just try to answer it, as quickly and as accurately as you can. Here we go. Premise 1, all puppies are dogs. Premise 2, all dogs are vicious. Does it follow, as a conclusion, that all puppies are vicious? Valid or invalid? And you can pause if you want more time. Let's try syllogism number 3. All dogs are animals. Some animals are pets. Does it follow that some dogs are pets? Valid or invalid? I'll give you all the answers in a moment. Okay, syllogism number 4. All sharks are animals. Some animals are pets. Does it follow that some sharks are pets? Valid or invalid? And finally, syllogism number 1. All puppies are dogs. All dogs eat. Therefore, all puppies eat. Valid or invalid? Okay, let me explain. Now see, an important corollary of the fact that validity is independent, is a formal property and is independent of the truth value of the conclusion. See, this means that it can happen that you get a valid inference that has a false conclusion, and you get a invalid inference that can have a true conclusion. And this seems to be very confusing, or rather, this seems to be information that we're sensitive to. Let me explain in more detail. Take the two syllogisms to the left. What you might have noticed, 1 and 2, is that they actually are the exact same logic structure. These two syllogisms are identical. They both are in the form all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. And this is a valid deduction. However, it is possible that whereas you thought that syllogism number 1 was valid, you might have been tempted to think that syllogism number 2 was invalid. And see, what's happening is that although both are valid, the conclusion of syllogism number 1 is highly believable. I mean, puppies eat, of course they do, right? Highly believable. It's true. The conclusion of syllogism number 2, on the other hand, highly non-believable, right? Puppies don't tend to be vicious. And somehow, just because the conclusion, the truth value of the conclusion is false, right? Puppies are not vicious. People sometimes tend to mistakenly identify this valid argument as invalid. Now, similarly, for the same reason, you can take an argument that is invalid, and syllogism 3 and 4 as a logic structure are both invalid. These are the form, both are all A's are B, some B's are C's. Does it follow that some A's are C's? And the argument is invalid. However, again, the conclusion of syllogism number 3, some dogs are pets, highly believable, right? True, the conclusion is true, that the statement in the conclusion is true. The argument is invalid. Similarly, syllogism number 4, the conclusion, the statement of the conclusion is false, some sharks are pets, and the argument itself is invalid. In other words, the first argument is valid and has a conclusion that is the statement in the conclusion is highly believable. The second syllogism is valid but has a non-believable conclusion. The third syllogism is invalid and has a believable conclusion. And the fourth syllogism is invalid and has a non-believable conclusion. What is interesting is that this matching or mismatching of validity and believability tends to exert a strong effect on how we judge arguments. For example, take the first one. The first one was valid and the conclusion was believable. People typically tend to judge these type of arguments as valid 89% of the time. So they tend to be pretty good at correctly judging the argument as valid. On the other hand, syllogism number 2, which was valid but had a non-believable conclusion, people only judge that 56% of the times as valid. Now, if you think of it, argument 1 and argument 2 are the exact same logic structure. So if all we cared about were the logic form of an argument, these two should be identical. We should judge them exactly in the same way. And yet, just because the last statement in this argument is not true, we somehow confuse it for meaning that the argument is invalid. And this difference between what we accept, the same logic form when we accept it as true because the conclusion is believable, versus when we accept it less as true because the conclusion is non-believable, is known as the belief bias. And it happens for valid arguments. It also happens for invalid arguments. You'll remember the syllogism number 4, the argument, the logic form is invalid, and the conclusion, which was that some sharks are pets, I believe, conclusion not believable. And indeed, most of the times, 90% of the times, people think it's not valid. However, if you give the exact same logic structure, but with a believable conclusion, 71% of the times, people think it's actually valid, and they're incorrect. The logic argument, just like in syllogism 4 and syllogism 3, is the same, it is equally invalid. But just because that last sentence is believable, people tend to think that the argument is valid. And again, the difference in judgment in the same logic structure when the conclusion is believable versus when the conclusion is not believable is again known as the belief bias. In other words, the belief bias is a tendency to reject valid syllogisms if the conclusion is not believable, and is the tendency to accept invalid syllogisms if the conclusion is believable. Now, a different kind of example of how the actual psychology of reasoning differs from the principles of logic, meaning that we do not seem to always make use of the principles of logic in guiding our inference making, is known as the atmosphere heuristic. Let me give you another example. Take this argument. Some A's are B's, some A's are C's. Does it follow that some B's are C's? Valid or invalid? Well, if you ask a large group of people, 51% of the times, people will judge this as valid. In fact, the argument is invalid. However, if I just change slightly the conclusion to be, therefore, does it follow that some B's are not C's, all of a sudden, only 29% of the people judge it as valid. I think what's happening here is that because you read the two premises and they both are of the form some are and some are, it kind of leads you to expect that the conclusion should also be some are. So if you get a conclusion that is some are, it just kind of makes you want to say, oh, they match, so it has to be valid, even though it is not. In a sense, it's not too dissimilar from the belief bias, from the type of effect of belief bias that we just saw. Except what's happening here is that the premises are kind of building an atmosphere of some are, and so you expect the conclusion to match. And if the conclusion does match the premises, you become biased towards wanting to say that it's valid, even though the logic structure per se is invalid. On the other hand, if the conclusion does not match, then you don't get that effect. Similarly, here's a second example of the same thing. If your premise one, no A's are B's, premise two, no A's are C's, does it follow that no B's are C's? 21% of the time, people accept this as being valid, even though it's invalid. And again, it suffices to change the structure of the conclusion to be some B's are not C's, to make people no longer accept this as valid. And indeed, again, these two inferences also are invalid inferences. So see, what's happening is what is known. And here the same, the two no are just kind of invite the conclusion to also have a no are. So when you get a conclusion that matches the premises, and it's a little more complicated than that, but I'll get to it in a second, it just kind of makes you want to say, sure, it's a valid conclusion. And this is what we refer to as the atmosphere heuristic. People just tend to be more likely to accept an argument as valid, even though it is not, when the qualifying words, such as all, some, no, in the premises, match the qualifying words in the conclusion. And in fact, in the using the words of one of the classic demonstrations of this by Wordsworth and Sells, if one of the premises, if the premises, sorry, are universal affirmative, so if they are of the type all X is Y, it just kind of gives you an all yes type atmosphere. And so if your conclusion matches it, you just want to think that it biases you towards believing that it's a valid conclusion. Similarly, if you get a universal negative, if your premises are no X is Y, that kind of gives you an all no atmosphere, an expectation that the conclusion should also be all no. And similar, if you get a particular affirmative or a particular negative, so statements of the type some X is Y or some X is not Y, they each kind of give rise to a some yes or a some no atmosphere. Now, on top of this, you can actually, the premises don't need to be of the same kind. It turns out that if your premises are mixed, if you have at least one of them as a particular, meaning if at least one of them says some, people just seem to prefer conclusions that also have some in them. Meaning, if the conclusion also has some in them, they'll be tempted to think that it's a valid deduction, even if it is not. Similarly, if at least one of the two premises has a negative in it, has a no in it, then people will be more likely to accept as valid an invalid argument that has in the conclusion also a negation, also a no. So this is the affect heuristic. Again, an example of how very clearly deductive reasoning, so the psychology of reasoning, makes use of these non-strictly logical cues, be it the matching of qualifiers and premises and conclusion, or be it the believability of a conclusion. So we use these additional cues in order to help guide our deductive inferences.